Morning of my engagement dinner, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my childhood home and told myself everything was going to be fine. I believed it. That was the embarrassing part. I actually believed it. My mother was downstairs pressing her good dress, the navy one she'd bought on sale 3 years ago and saved for important occasions. My father had gotten a haircut the day before, and he'd asked me twice if his tie was appropriate for a restaurant like Alderton's. Alderton's. That's where my future in-laws had chosen to host the dinner. $38 for an entree, white tablecloths, a sommelier who materialized silently at your elbow without being asked. My father had looked up the menu online and gone quiet in a way that made my chest hurt. "It's just dinner, Dad," I'd told him. "I know," he'd said. And then he'd asked about the tie again. His name was Theodore, but everyone called him Ted. My mother was June. They'd spent 30 years running a small landscaping business in Harrowfield, Ohio, the kind of work that leaves dirt under your fingernails even after you've scrubbed them. They weren't polished, they weren't wealthy, but they had driven 4 hours to be there, and they had ironed their clothes, and my father had gotten a haircut. That should have been enough. It should have been enough for. It should have been more than enough. My fiancé's name was Whitmore. Whit, to most people. We'd met 2 years earlier at a conference in Columbus, where he'd been presenting on commercial real estate development, and I'd been there covering it for the regional business journal I worked for. He was sharp and funny, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. When he called the next day, I told my roommate I thought I might be in trouble. I was right. Just not in the way I'd imagined. His family was from Westlake. Old money, or the kind of money that had been around long enough to feel old. His mother's name was Cecile, and she wore her hair in a low chignon that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly grocery budget. His father, Roland, was semi-retired from a law firm whose name appeared on buildings. They had opinions about wine vintages and renovations in neighborhoods I'd never been to. Whit had told me early on that his mother could be a lot. He'd smiled when he said it, the way you smile about something you've already decided isn't your problem to solve. I should have asked more questions. I should have paid attention to that smile. But I loved him, so I told myself it would be fine. The reservation at Alderton's was for 7:30. My parents and I arrived at 7:15. I was wearing the green silk dress Whit had helped me pick out, and my mother had done something careful with her hair, and my father's tie was exactly right, though he didn't know it yet. We were shown to the private dining room in the back. It was beautiful, low light, a long table set for 14, fresh flowers in a low arrangement so you could see across to the people on the other side. I remember thinking it looked like a magazine spread. Cecile was already there. She was standing near the window with a glass of sparkling water, and when we walked in, her eyes moved over my parents the way you assess something you're not sure belongs in the room. She smiled. The smile didn't reach anything. "June and Ted," she said. "So glad you made it all this way." "We wouldn't have missed it," my mother said warmly. She meant it completely. Cecile made a small sound, not quite agreement, and turned to say something to the woman beside her. I felt it then, that first low hum of wrongness. I filed it away. Whit arrived 20 minutes later, flushed and apologetic, his collar slightly crooked. He kissed me and shook my father's hand and hugged my mother, and the room got easier for a moment. He had that effect. He could warm a space just by walking into it, and I'd loved that about him for 2 years, and that night I leaned on it harder than I should have. Dinner was served in courses. I watched my mother read the menu carefully, quietly, the way she did when she was working out math in her head. She ordered the salmon, which was the second least expensive thing. My father ordered the same. I noticed. I don't think they knew I noticed. Cecile sat at the head of the table nearest the window. She had arranged the seating herself. I learned this later, that she called the restaurant and revised the placement twice, and my parents were at the far end, separated from Whittenby by 4 of his relatives I'd met exactly once. His Aunt Margot, his cousin Fletcher. Fletcher's wife, whose name I kept forgetting. Someone's college friend who'd apparently been absorbed into the family years ago and never left. My parents were not next to me. They were not near me. They were at the other end of a long table, flanked by people who did not know them and did not particularly try. I didn't understand, at first, that this was intentional, I found out because I went to the restroom between the salad and the entree, and I passed the corridor where Cecile was speaking quietly to Aunt Margot. I almost kept walking. I wish I had kept walking, but I heard my mother's name. June seems very sweet, Margot was saying. In that way. She is, Cecile said. They both are. Salt of the earth. I just thought it would be easier, for everyone, to give them their own little corner. They're not really going to have much to talk about with the Hendersons. No, Margot agreed. No, I suppose not. I stood in that corridor for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Salt of the earth. Their own little corner. I just thought it would be easier. I went to the restroom. I looked at myself in the mirror, the green silk dress, the careful eye makeup, the small pearl earrings my mother had lent me for the occasion. I turned on the cold water and held my wrists under it until my hands stopped shaking. When I walked back to the table, I looked at my father. He was listening politely to something Fletcher was saying, nodding at intervals, and I could see from across the room that he had no idea what Fletcher was talking about. My mother was cutting her salmon into precise, small pieces. She was smiling at nothing in particular. They were making the best of it. That was what they did. That was what they had always done. I sat down next to Whit and put my hand on his arm. "Did you know she moved the seating?" I said quietly. He glanced at me. "What?" "Your mother. She changed where my parents are sitting. They're at the other end of the table." He looked down the table briefly, then back at his plate. "It's a long table, Simone. Everyone's sitting somewhere, Simone. That's me. I should have said that earlier. I kept waiting for the right moment, and I kept missing it. Whit! She put them there on purpose. I heard her in the hallway. She said they wouldn't have anything to talk about with the Hendersons. She gave them their own corner." He picked up his fork. "My mother just wants the dinner to go smoothly." "For who?" "For everyone." "She didn't ask me," I said. "It's our engagement dinner. She didn't ask me where my parents should sit." "Simone." His voice was low, careful, the voice he used when he thought I was making a thing into a bigger thing. "Can we talk about this later? This isn't the time." I looked at him for a moment. Then I picked up my own fork. We did not talk about it later. What happened instead was dessert. Cecile gave a toast. She stood up with her champagne. Vive Clicquot. She'd specified it to the sommelier earlier, and she talked about Whit's accomplishments and her hopes for his future, and how glad she was to be welcoming someone into the family. She looked at me when she said that. She smiled the Chignon smile. She did not mention my parents. She did not look at them. She said my name once, at the end, almost as punctuation. My mother was applauding. She was genuinely applauding, her hands meeting in that bright, earnest way she had, because she didn't know yet. She thought this was a celebration. She thought she was being welcomed. And something in me, something that had been quietly building since the corridor, since the seating chart, since my father's haircut and his careful tie, and the way he'd asked me twice if it was right, something in me came undone. I stood up. I don't entirely remember deciding to do it. I remember being seated, and then I remember being on my feet, and I remember Whit's hand reaching for my arm and missing. "I'd like to say something," I said. The table went quiet. 14 people looking at me. I picked up my glass. "First, Mom, Dad, can you come up here? I want you next to me." I watched my parents exchange a glance. My mother pressed her napkin to her mouth. They stood, and they made their way around the table, and I pulled 2 chairs to where Whit and I were sitting, and I put one hand on each of their arms when they reached me. "I want to say something about these 2 people," I said, "because I realized tonight that I haven't said it loudly enough." Cecile had gone very still at the end of the table. "My parents drove 4 hours to be here tonight. My father asked me twice if his tie was right because he wanted to make a good impression on people who matter to me. My mother saved her best dress for this dinner. They built everything they have from nothing with their hands, and they gave me every advantage they possibly could. And they are the reason I am the kind of person Whit fell in love with. If he fell in love with someone worth loving, and I hope he did, that is because of them." I heard my mother make a small sound. I didn't look at her because I knew if I looked at her I would stop talking. I also want to say that I've spent this dinner becoming aware that the people I love most in this world were seated as far from me as possible, and I've been told it was for their comfort, or for everyone's comfort, and I want to be clear, it was not. It was a choice, and it was made without my knowledge, and it told me something I needed to know. The room was so quiet I could hear the restaurant noise bleeding through from outside. I love Whit, I said. I love him genuinely, and I came here tonight ready to begin a life with his family. But a life requires honesty, and the honest thing is this. I will not build a marriage on a foundation where my parents are placed in a corner at our own celebration because someone decided they didn't belong at the center. That is not a foundation. That is a warning. I set my glass down. I'm not making a scene, I said, mostly to myself. I'm making a decision, and I think I've been needing to make it for a while. I turned to my parents. I'm sorry, I said. I'm sorry it took me this long. My mother was crying quietly. My father put his arm around her, and he was very straight, the way he got when he was holding himself together, and he nodded at me once. Just once. I looked at Whit. He was sitting very still. His face was doing something complicated, something that wanted to be disbelief but was already curdling into something else, something that looked like the beginning of understanding what this moment actually was. I need to think, I said quietly, to him specifically. I need some time. I picked up my clutch. Thank you for dinner, I said to the table, because my mother raised me to have manners, even in the rooms where it's hard. I hope the rest of the evening is lovely. And then I walked out. My parents came with me. We stood in the parking lot of Aldertons in the November cold, my mother still pressing her fingers under her eyes, my father's arm still around her, and for a long moment none of us said anything. Then my father said, "Your tie looks right, doesn't it?" I laughed. It came out a little wet. "It looks perfect, Dad." My mother laughed too. The way she did when crying and laughing were the same release. She reached out and straightened my lapel, a small automatic gesture, the kind mothers make without thinking. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "I wanted to. We would have been fine. I know that too." I looked at her. "That's not the point." She looked at me for a moment, and then she pulled me into a hug that smelled like her good perfume, the one she kept in the medicine cabinet for special occasions, and I held on probably longer than a 31-year-old woman in a silk dress in a parking lot should. Whit called that night. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and I let that go too, and then I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and listened to both messages in sequence. The first one was defensive. He talked about how I'd embarrassed his family, and how I hadn't given him a chance to address it privately, and how his mother was just someone who had a specific way of doing things, and I had to understand that. He said, "My mother," 6 times. I counted. The second message was different. It was quieter. He said he'd been sitting in his car in the parking garage for an hour, and he'd been thinking, and he knew it wasn't handled right, and he was sorry. He said he was sorry 3 times. I believed him about the parking garage. I believed him about the parking garage. I believed the sorry too, to some extent. The problem, and this was the thing I had to sit with, the thing I turned over for the weeks after, was that the sorry came after. It came after I walked out, after I said the thing out loud in front of 14 people, after I made it impossible to pretend. The sorry required an audience. I thought about my father asking about his tie. I thought about my mother saving her dress. I thought about 4 hours on the highway to sit at the far end of a table at their daughter's engagement dinner. The question I kept coming back to was simple. What would have happened if I hadn't gone to the restroom? If I hadn't stood up? Would have noticed, on his own, where my parents were sitting? Would it have bothered him? I thought I knew the answer. And the answer was the problem. We talked 3 times that week, real conversations. Whit was genuinely trying. I could hear it, and some part of me wanted to meet him there, wanted to find the version of this story where the parking garage moment was the turning point, and we rebuilt from it. I wanted that version. I had been building toward that version for 2 years, but every time we talked, he mentioned his mother, how she hadn't meant anything by it, how she just had a certain way of wanting things done, how once we were married, it would be different, because it would be our household and she'd have to respect that boundary. She has to respect it now, I said in our third conversation. It's complicated, he said. Family is complicated. My family is complicated. My family is complicated too, I said. You've never had to negotiate for them. He didn't have an answer for that. I heard him breathing on the other end of the line, and I thought about how much I had loved that sound for 2 years, how many nights I'd fallen asleep on the phone with him when we were long distance in the early months. I think, I said slowly, that you are a good person who is going to need to make some choices that are hard for you, and I think right now you're not ready to make them. And that's honest, and I'm grateful that you're being honest about it, even when you don't realize you are. But I can't wait for you to be ready. I can't build a life around hoping. He asked if we could try couples counseling, a longer engagement, more time. I need to take some time on my own, I told him. I'll be in touch when I know what I want. I gave the ring back 2 months later. It was a clean decision, which surprised me. I had expected it to feel like breaking something, and instead, it felt like finally naming a thing that had already been decided the night I stood up at that table. Cecile never called me, never wrote. I don't know if I expected her to. I think I'd stopped expecting things from her somewhere around the corridor. My parents called the week after the dinner, both of them on speaker, which they did sometimes when the thing they wanted to say felt important enough to say together. We want you to know, my father said, that we think you did the right thing. You don't have to say that, I told them. We know we don't, my mother said. That's how you know we mean it. I thought about that for a long time afterward. That's how you know we mean it. I thought about that for a long time afterward. That's how you know. There's a version of this story where I could have handled it quieter, more privately, or I could have waited until the drive home and called Whit the next day and worked through it in the proper ordered way that people work through things. Maybe that version would have had a different ending. I've wondered about it. But here's what I know. I was 31 years old and I was wearing a silk dress and I was sitting at a beautiful table and my parents were at the other end of it because someone had decided that's where they belonged, and I was sitting there in the quiet agreeing to it, pretending it was fine, filing the feeling away for later. I have spent a lot of my life filing things away for later, being reasonable, choosing the moment, keeping the peace. That night, I chose something else. I chose the thing that my mother and father had spent 30 years teaching me without ever saying it directly, that some things are worth more than the comfort of the room, that the people who raised you deserve to be seen, that love without respect is just performance. They had driven 4 hours to sit at my table. That was the baseline. Everything else followed from there. My father's tie was exactly right. I just wish I had told him sooner.